They called her Ash Tongue. It was a cruel name, born of the soot she was always scrubbing and the silence she was forced to keep. Alara didn't remember the last time she had spoken a full sentence aloud. Words were a currency she could not afford. Her world was a palette of gray and black. Gray stone floors, chilled to the bone even in summer. Black iron pots that scoured her hands raw. The gray, unforgiving sky of the northern wastes, a constant lid on her life. Cold was her most intimate companion. It seeped through the threadbare wool of her tunic, settled deep in her marrow, and made her teeth ache with a familiar, dull throb. Tonight, the cold was a predator. Wind sliced like obsidian claws through the cracks in the great hall's walls, carrying the scent of pine and an impending blizzard. She was on her knees, scrubbing a patch of floor where a drunken pack warrior had spilled his ale. The lye soap burned the cuts on her knuckles, a sharp counterpoint to the numbing chill. Her stomach was a hollow, aching void. Dinner had been a crust of stale bread she'd eaten in the scullery, hidden away like a rat. It was never enough. It was only ever just enough to keep her alive for another day of servitude. She was an orphan, a stray taken in by the Stonecrest pack out of some long-forgotten obligation. They never let her forget her place. She was less than an omega. She was nothing. A ghost who polished silver and hauled water, her presence tolerated only as long as she remained invisible. "Look at it," a voice sneered, sharp and cutting as splintered ice. Alara flinched, her shoulders hunching instinctively. Lyra. The Alpha's daughter stood over her, flanked by two of her friends. Her fine leather boots were inches from Alara's raw hands. "Still scrubbing the same spot, Ashtongue? Are you trying to wear a hole right through to the dirt you came from?" Laughter followed, tinkling and cruel. Alara kept her eyes down, her world shrinking to the grimy floorboards. Don't look up. Don't speak. Don't exist. These were the rules that kept her safe, or, at least, kept the beatings to a minimum. A boot nudged her side hard. "I'm speaking to you, filth!" Alara squeezed her eyes shut, a tremor running through her. She could feel the heat of their collective gaze on her bowed head. She was a spectacle, a toy. "She's probably forgotten how to talk," another girl giggled. "She only knows how to grunt and scrape." Lyra made a thoughtful, mocking sound. "Perhaps we should remind her." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the dull ache of hunger and misery. Lyra's reminders were always painful. Suddenly, the bucket of dirty, freezing water beside her was kicked over. The icy deluge shocked the breath from her lungs, soaking her thin tunic and plastering it to her skin. It was a cold so profound, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. She gasped, unable to stop the sound from escaping her lips. The girls howled with laughter. "Now you can start over," Lyra said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And do it properly this time." They moved away, their laughter echoing in the vast, empty hall. Alara remained on her hands and knees, shivering uncontrollably. The water was already starting to freeze on the floor, and on her. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. Tears were a weakness, another thing they could take from her. Instead, she clenched her jaw, the muscles in her neck cording with effort. She would not break. She would not shatter. This was her only defiance, to endure. She gritted her teeth against the chattering, picked up her brush, and began to scrub again, pushing the icy water across the floor with numb fingers. The smell of spilled ale and lye filled her senses, a perfume of her worthlessness. She pushed forward, one scrape at a time, her mind a blank slate of misery. This was her life, an endless cycle of cold, hunger, and humiliation. What was the point of enduring? The question was a traitor, slithering into her thoughts when she was at her weakest. She had no answer. There was no hope for a better tomorrow, no one waiting for her, no one who would even notice if she simply faded away. But still, a tiny, stubborn ember glowed deep within her chest. A refusal. She didn't know what it was or where it came from, but it was there. A small, hard kernel of strength that had weathered every storm. She finished the floor an hour later, her body a single, agonizing ache. Her fingers were blue, her tunic stiff with ice. She was sent out to the woodshed to fetch more logs for the great hall's fire, a punishment for her slowness. The blizzard had arrived. Wind howled like a starving wolf, tearing at her clothes and driving snow into her eyes. The world beyond the keep was a churning vortex of white. She could barely see the dark shape of the woodshed a few 100 feet away. Each step was a battle. The snow was already deep, sucking at her worn-out boots. The cold was no longer just a companion. It was an active enemy, trying to steal the breath from her lungs and freeze the blood in her veins. She reached the shed, her body shaking so violently she could barely work the latch. Inside, it was marginally better. The wind couldn't reach her, but the cold was a heavy, dead thing that clung to the air. She loaded her arms with as many logs as she could carry, the rough bark scraping her frozen skin. The weight was immense, bowing her back and straining her muscles. She turned to head back, and the world vanished. The wind shrieked, a physical wall of sound and ice. The keep, which had been a faint smudge of light, was gone, swallowed by the storm. Panic, a different kind than the one Lyra inspired, seized her. This was not the sting of humiliation. This was the cold, clean terror of death. She took a step, then another, trying to force her way back in the direction she'd come. The snow was deeper now, the wind a relentless force pushing her, turning her. She was lost. Lost in a sea of white, just yards from the only home she'd ever known. The irony was a bitter pill. She tripped, the heavy logs spilling from her arms. She fell face first into a snowdrift, the impact driving the air from her lungs. The snow was soft, almost welcoming. It muffled the sound of the storm. It would be so easy to just lie here, to let the cold take her, to finally sleep. No. That stubborn ember inside her flared. She would not die like this. She would not give Lyra the satisfaction. She pushed herself up, gasping, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. She didn't know which way to go. Every direction looked the same, a churning, endless white. She stumbled forward, driven by pure instinct. She didn't know how long she walked. Minutes felt like hours. The cold had moved past pain into a deep, pervasive numbness. Her thoughts grew sluggish, her movements clumsy. She was falling. Not into snow this time, but through something that cracked and gave way beneath her. Ice. The shock of the water was absolute. It was a cold beyond comprehension, a malevolent entity that stole her breath, her thoughts, her very soul. It dragged her down into the blackness of a frozen river. Her body convulsed, fighting for air that wasn't there. Her heavy, waterlogged clothes were an anchor, pulling her into the depths. This is it, she thought, a strange sense of calm settling over the terror. This is the end. Her lungs burned. Black spots danced in her vision. Then, a hand. It was not a hand so much as a force of nature. It clamped around her arm, impossibly strong, impossibly warm. The warmth was the most shocking thing of all, a searing heat against the lethal cold. She was being pulled upward, breaking the surface with a desperate, ragged gasp. Air filled her burning lungs. She coughed, sputtering river water, her body limp as a doll's. She was hauled from the water and onto the snowy bank with an ease that defied belief. She lay there, a shivering wreck, unable to move or think. A figure loomed over her, a mountain against the swirling snow. He was massive, wrapped in thick black furs, his presence a shield against the storm's fury. The wind seemed to part around him. He knelt, and she saw his face. It was a face carved from granite and moonlight, harsh and predatorily beautiful. His hair was the color of a winter night, long and unbound, dusted with snow. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of molten gold, and they glowed with their own internal light. They were the eyes of a wolf, the eyes of a king. She knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who this was. Kale, the Alpha King of the North. A figure of myth and terror, a ruler so powerful the lesser packs like Stonecrest paid him tribute just to be left alone. What was he doing here? He reached for her, and she flinched away, a lifetime of ingrained fear taking over. His hand stopped, hovering in the air between them. His golden eyes softened, a flicker of some unreadable emotion in their depths. "You're freezing," he said. His voice was deep, a rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It was not unkind. He moved slowly, deliberately, stripping off his heavy outer cloak of black wolf fur. He wrapped it around her shivering body. The warmth was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was like being held by the sun. The fur was impossibly soft, and it smelled of pine, winter storms, and something else. Something ancient and powerful. Something that felt like home. The thought was so alien, so absurd, she almost laughed. He gathered her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. Her head fell against his chest, and she could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart through the layers of his tunic. The heat of his body was a furnace, chasing the deadly chill from her limbs. As he held her, his hand brushed against the bare skin of her neck. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling. A bolt of white-hot lightning shot through her veins, a searing, brilliant energy that lit up every cell in her body. She cried out, a raw, involuntary sound torn from her throat. It felt like she was being unmade and remade all at once. Pain and pleasure, terror and ecstasy, all crashed together in a tidal wave of sensation. On her neck, where his fingers had touched, a burning began. It was an intense, focused heat, like a brand being pressed into her skin. She could feel something forming there, a pattern of fire tracing itself into her flesh. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. What was happening? His golden eyes were blazing now, wide with a shocked, fierce intensity. Paragraphs, paragraphs. The gold seemed to swirl, to deepen, shot through with threads of pure, molten silver. He stared down at her, at the spot on her neck, and a single word escaped his lips. A whisper, a prayer, a claim. Mine. The world tilted on its axis. Her mind, numb with cold and shock, couldn't process it. His gaze locked with hers, and she felt as though he were seeing not just her face, but straight into the tattered, hidden corners of her soul. He saw the fear. He saw the pain. He saw the worthlessness. And in those glowing golden eyes, she saw none of it reflected back. she saw only wonder. "You're her," he breathed, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "After all this time, you're her." Her body, which had been fighting him, suddenly went limp. A strange calm washed over her. The burning on her neck subsided into a warm, pleasant thrum. Her instincts, buried under years of abuse and fear, were screaming a single undeniable truth. Safe. Her mind rebelled. How could she be safe with this terrifying stranger, this mythical king? It made no sense. Nothing made sense. But her body knew. Her soul knew. She was so tired. The fight went out of her, replaced by an exhaustion so profound it was like a physical weight. Her eyelids fluttered shut. The last thing she felt was his arms tightening around her, pulling her impossibly closer, a fortress against the storm. "I have you," he murmured, his voice a deep thunder against her ear. "I have you now." And then, darkness. She woke to warmth. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that reached all the way to her bones. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. She had never been this warm in her entire life. She was lying on a bed of soft furs in a small enclosed space. A fire crackled nearby, its light dancing on rough-hewn stone walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing noise in the quiet. She was wearing a simple, clean tunic of soft wool. It was too large for her, but it was dry and warm. Her old, frozen clothes were nowhere to be seen. Memory came rushing back. The blizzard, the ice, the glowing golden eyes. She sat up with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Easy," the deep voice came from the other side of the fire. The Alpha King, Kale, was sitting on a low stool tending to a piece of meat roasting on a spit. He looked even larger in the enclosed space, his shoulders broad enough to block out half the firelight. He turned his head and his golden eyes met hers. They were softer now. The fierce blaze banked to a warm, steady glow. "You're safe," he said. She instinctively raised a hand to her neck. Her fingers traced a pattern on her skin that hadn't been there before. It was a swirl of intricate lines, slightly raised like a delicate scar. It tingled at her touch, a faint echo of the fire that had created it. The claiming mark, the soul bond. She'd heard whispers of such things in the scullery, old tales told by the crones. A bond so rare it was legend. A fated connection between two souls, forged by the gods, marked in flesh. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening to her, to Ashtongue, to nothing. What is this?" she whispered, her voice a rusty croak from disuse. He rose and came to her, moving with a predator's silent grace. He knelt before the bed of furs, so they were at eye level. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was an overwhelming force, a gravity that pulled her in. "It is our bond," he said simply, as if explaining the weather. "I have been searching for you for a very long time." Her mind reeled. "Me?" The word was a puff of disbelief. "Why would you be searching for me? I'm no one." A flicker of something dark and dangerous crossed his face. "Who told you that?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. She flinched, looking down at her hands. "Everyone. Her whole life." He seemed to understand without her saying a word. "They were wrong," he stated. It was not an opinion. It was a declaration of absolute fact. He held out the spit of roasted meat. "Eat," he commanded gently. "You need your strength." She hesitated, then her hunger won out. She took the meat, the warmth of it seeping into her cold fingers. It was rabbit, cooked perfectly, and it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate ravenously, without shame. He watched her, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. It was like watching the sunrise on a harsh, unforgiving landscape. It changed everything. When she was done, he offered her a water skin. She drank deeply, the cool water soothing her raw throat. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice a little stronger now. "A hunter's cave I know of. We'll be safe here until the storm passes." Safe. There was that word again. She looked at him, truly looked at him, trying to reconcile the terrifying myth with the man kneeling before her. The power rolling off him was immense, a palpable aura of command and ancient strength. But the way he looked at her, no one had ever looked at her like that, like she was precious, like she mattered. It was terrifying. It was hope, and hope was a dangerous thing. They spent 2 days in the cave while the blizzard raged outside. He spoke little, but his presence was a constant, comforting weight. He cared for her with a quiet efficiency, ensuring she was always warm, always fed. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply was, and she found herself unfurling. Like a frozen flower finally touched by the sun. She started to speak more, her voice gaining confidence. She told him her name was Alara, and watched as he rolled the syllables on his tongue as if they were a priceless treasure. She did not tell him about the name Ashtongue. She did not tell him about Lyra, or the scrubbing, or the constant, grinding humiliation. She didn't have to. She felt somehow that he already knew. The bond between them was a living thing, a low, steady hum beneath her skin that connected her to him. She could feel his emotions as a faint echo in her own heart, a deep, abiding loneliness now being filled with a fierce, protective joy. It was overwhelming. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. Sunlight, brilliant and white, streamed into the mouth of the cave. "It is time to go," Kale said. "Go where?" she asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Home," he answered, his golden eyes locking with hers. "To my home. Our home." He led her out of the cave and back towards the Stonecrest Keep. The world was transformed, blanketed in a pristine, glittering layer of snow. When the keep came into view, a hulking gray shape against the white, her steps faltered. Fear, cold and familiar, washed over her. This was not home. This was her prison. Kale's hand found hers, his large, warm fingers enveloping her small, cold ones. The contact sent a jolt of reassurance straight to her soul. "I am with you," he said, his voice a low promise. "No one will ever harm you again." They did not go to the scullery entrance. He strode towards the main gates, his bearing that of a king returning to his castle, pulling her along in his wake. The guards at the gate, their faces slack with shock, scrambled to open them. They walked into the great hall, the same hall where she had been scrubbing the floor just days ago. It was filled with the pack's warriors breaking their fast. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Every eye was on them. On him. And on her, the worthless scullery maid, her hand held firmly in the grip of the Alpha King. She saw Lyra at the high table, her mouth agape, a piece of bread halfway to her lips. Her eyes narrowed, first in confusion, then in dawning, venomous rage as she saw their joined hands. Then her gaze fell to Alara's neck. Lyra's eyes widened, her face paling. She recognized the mark, or at least she understood what it signified. acclaim, power, a status Alara should never, ever have. Alara wanted to shrink, to become invisible again, but Cale's grip was an anchor. He didn't even look at the stunned crowd. His focus was entirely on her. "You will gather your things," he said, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the silent hall. She had nothing to gather. A spare, ragged tunic and a small wooden bird her mother had carved for her before she died. That was the sum of her worldly possessions. She nodded mutely. He was going to take her away. He was going to save her. The hope was so bright it was painful. But she never got the chance. Lyra, her face a mask of fury, shoved her chair back and stood up. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked at Cale, her voice shrill. Then her eyes, full of malice, landed back on Alara. "You," she spat. "What trickery is this, you little snake?" Before Cale could even turn, another voice cut through the tension, cold and sharp. "The Alpha King graces us with his presence, and he brings a stray." A man stepped out from the shadows near the hearth. He was tall and thin, dressed in robes the color of dried blood, embroidered with silver sigils Alara didn't recognize. His face was pale, his eyes black and empty as a starless night. A cold dread, entirely different from the fear of Lyra or the awe of Cale, washed over her. This was a wrongness, a corruption. Cale moved, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. His body went rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "Malachor," he snarled, "what are you doing this far north? Your Ember Covenant has no power here." The man, Malachor, smiled. It was a thin, bloodless expression. "Power is not given, Your Majesty. It is taken." His dead eyes flickered to Alara and his smile widened. "And you have just found a very interesting key." He saw the mark. He understood. He saw her not as a person, but as a tool, a way to get to Cale. "She is nothing to you," Cale said, his voice dropping to a lethal calm. "Leave now, and I will allow you to keep your life." Malachor chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Oh, I think not." He raised a hand, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, to coalesce. From the darkest corners, figures emerged. Men dressed in the same blood-red robes, their faces hidden by cowls. They had been here all along, waiting. Lyra's father, the Stonecrest Alpha, looked on, his face a mask of terror and indecision. He had made a deal with this devil. He had sold them out. Everything happened at once. Cale shoved Alara behind him, a roar of pure fury erupting from his throat as he shifted, his form expanding, his features sharpening into the fearsome hybrid of man and wolf. Claws burst from his fingertips. But Malachor was not there to fight. He snapped his fingers. The world dissolved into chaos. A cloud of black, choking smoke erupted from the floor, smelling of sulfur and ash. Alara screamed as hands grabbed her, pulling her away from Cale. They were unnaturally strong, their touch burning cold. "Cale!" she cried, his name torn from her lungs. She saw his face for a split second through the smoke, his golden eyes wide with rage and panic. He fought to get to her, tearing through the robed figures, but they swarmed him, their movements unnatural and swift. A cloth was pressed over her face. It smelled sweet and cloying. Her head spun. The bond, that warm, steady hum, shrieked in her soul. Being pulled from him was a physical agony, like her spirit was being ripped in two. The last thing she heard was his howl of utter despair. Then, blackness claimed her once more. Her life became a cage, a cell deep in the bowels of some dark fortress far to the south. There was no sun, only the flickering, greasy light of torches that smelled of rendered fat. Her world was stone and iron and the pervasive chill of despair. Malachor kept her alive, but only just. He visited her sometimes, his dead eyes studying her as if she were an insect under glass. He spoke of his plans, of the coming war, of how the bond made her the perfect weapon against the Alpha King. "He is strong," Malachor would say, his voice a dry whisper. "But this connection is his one weakness, and through it, I will break him. I will drain him, and you, my dear, will be the vessel." The bond was a source of constant pain. The distance was a raw, open wound in her soul. She could feel Cale's frantic searching, his rage, his desperation, as a constant, agonizing echo. They had chained her with silver, the metal burning her skin and dampening the bond, making the connection fuzzy and weak. It was a torment designed to break her spirit, and it was working. Weeks turned into months. The seasons changed in the world above, but not in her stone prison. She grew weaker, thinner. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in the hunter's cave began to wither. And then, something changed. A new life flickered within her. At first, she thought it was a sickness, another torment inflicted by her captors. But the feeling grew, a tiny, insistent flutter in her womb. She was pregnant. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. A child, Cale's child, conceived in those 2 precious days of warmth and safety. A new, ferocious kind of strength surged through her. This was no longer just about her own survival. She was not just a prisoner anymore. She was a mother. She had to protect this life, these lives. She knew, with a mother's unshakable certainty, that she carried more than one. Twins, a boy and a girl. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. Her secret became her shield. She hid her growing belly beneath her ragged clothes, ate the meager rations they gave her with a new determination. She was eating for 3. The months dragged on, a slow torture. Her body changed, grew heavy. It became harder to hide, but her captors were arrogant. They saw only a broken, worthless girl. They did not look closely. Then, the fortress began to shake. Faintly at first, then with more violence. Distant sounds of battle reached her even in her deep cell. Shouts, the clash of steel, the roar of shifting wolves. He was here. Cale had found her. The bond flared to life, the silver chains no longer able to contain the sheer force of his proximity. His presence was a blazing sun just beyond the horizon. Alara. His voice was not a sound, but a thought, a feeling, blasted directly into her soul through their connection. "Hold on, I am coming." Tears of relief streamed down her face. He was coming. But in the same moment, a terrible, sharp pain seized her, a contraction. It stole her breath, doubling her over. The babies, they were coming. Now! Panic warred with elation. Not here, not in this filthy cell. The chaos of the siege was her only chance. The guards who brought her food were gone, presumably called to the battle. Her cell door was barred from the outside, but the fortress was shaking, stones groaning under the assault. Another contraction, stronger this time. She cried out, gritting her teeth against the pain. She had to get out. With a strength born of pure desperation, she threw her shoulder against the ancient, rusted iron door. It barely budged. She did it again and again, A tremor shook the foundation, and with a screech of protesting metal, the lock mechanism, damaged by the strain, shattered. The door swung inward. She was free. The corridors were a nightmare of battle and shadow. She moved as quickly as her heavy body would allow, sticking to the walls, a ghost in the chaos. She needed somewhere safe, somewhere hidden. She found a narrow passage, half hidden behind a tapestry depicting one of Malicor's vile rituals. It led downwards, into the natural caves that the fortress had been built upon. The air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and stone. It was perfect. She found a small, defensible cavern, barely more than an alcove, and collapsed onto the cold ground, her body trembling with pain and exertion. The battle raged above, a distant thunder. Down here, there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. The contractions were coming faster now, harder. This was it. She was alone, giving birth on a cold stone floor in the middle of a war. Her only light the faint, bloody glow filtering down from the besieged fortress above. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. But the fierce, protective love for her unborn children was a fire that burned hotter. She would do this. She had to. Hours passed in a haze of agony. She screamed until her throat was raw, her nails digging into the soft earth. She was no one, a worthless stray, but in this cave, she was a force of nature, a vessel of life in a fortress of death. With a final, desperate push, the first baby was born, a boy. He was small, but his cry was strong and furious. Tears of joy and exhaustion streamed down her face as she cleaned him as best she could and wrapped him in a piece of her own torn tunic. But there was no time to rest. His sister was coming. The second birth was harder, sapping the last of her strength. But finally, the little girl was there, quiet and watchful, her eyes already open and alert. Alara lay back against the cold stone, her two tiny babies cradled against her chest, their warmth a miracle against the chill. She had done it. They were safe. And then a shadow fell over the mouth of the cave. Malicor stood there, his blood-red robe stained with soot and gore. His face was contorted in a mask of cold fury. So, the little rat found a hole to birth her whelps, he hissed, his black eyes fixing on the bundles in her arms. How inconvenient. Alara instinctively curled her body around her children, a pathetic shield against the darkness he embodied. "Get away from us," she snarled, the words a raw growl. He laughed. "The king is tearing my fortress apart, stone by stone. He is looking for you. But he will find this instead, his broken mate and his dead heirs." He took a step forward, raising a hand, shadows coalescing around his fingertips. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, a sob of despair catching in her throat. She had come so far, fought so hard, only to fail at the very end. "I told you," a voice like an avalanche boomed from the passage behind Malicor, "to leave her alone." Kale. He stood there, a terrifying vision of royal wrath. He was in his half-shifted form, his body larger, his claws extended, his golden eyes blazing with the light of 1,000 suns. He was covered in the blood and grime of battle, but to Alara, he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. His eyes met hers across the small space. They took in her state, the exhaustion, the pain. Then they fell to the two tiny bundles in her arms. The inferno in his gaze softened for a barest fraction of a second, replaced by a wave of stunned, overwhelming awe. His children. Malachor turned, his smile returning. Ah, the king arrives, just in time to watch the show. He lunged, not at Kale, but at Alara and the babies. Kale roared and moved faster than thought, a blur of black fur and righteous fury. He met Malachor in the center of the cave. The battle was brutal and swift. But Malachor was a creature of dark magic, of tricks and corruption. He threw a blast of shadowy energy that caught Kale in the chest, sending him staggering back. For a moment, Kale was on one knee, gasping, the light in his eyes dimming. He was hurt. He was in danger. Seeing him falter, seeing Malachor raise his hand for a killing blow, something inside Alara broke. The fear, the doubt, the years of being told she was worthless. All of it burned away in a blaze of pure, protective rage. He would not touch her mate. He would not touch her children. No! The word was not a scream. It was a command. It was a shockwave. Power, brilliant and white and pure as starlight, erupted from her. It was not the dark, parasitic magic of Malachor or the fierce, primal strength of Kale. It was the power of life itself. A dome of blinding light slammed outwards, engulfing the cave. It struck Malachor like a physical blow, and he shrieked, a sound of pure agony as the light burned away his shadows, seared his corrupted flesh. The light washed over Kale, and where it touched, his wounds knitted closed. His strength returned tenfold, his golden eyes flaring back to their full, blazing glory. The light touched her babies, wrapping them in a cocoon of warmth and safety. Alara stood up, her children held tight in one arm. She was no longer the shivering, terrified girl from the scullery. Her eyes glowed with a soft, silver light. Power hummed around her, a visible aura of white and silver. She was a queen. She was a mother. And she was done being afraid. She looked at the cowering, burned form of Malachor. "You called me a key," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she had never known. "A vessel. You were wrong." She raised her free hand. "I am the lock. I am the source." She fixed her gaze on him, pouring all her pain, all her rage, all her newfound strength into a single thought. "And you are nothing." Malachor screamed as the pure, life-giving energy proved to be the most potent poison to his shadowy existence. He dissolved, turning to ash and smoke, his final agonized cry echoing in the cavern before being silenced forever. The light receded, leaving the cave in a sudden, peaceful quiet. It was over. She stood there, swaying on her feet, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind an ocean of exhaustion. Strong arms were around her before she could fall. Kale held her, his touch full of reverence and awe. He buried his face in her hair, his massive frame trembling. "Alara," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned against him, her strength completely gone, trusting him to hold her up, to hold all of them up. He looked down at the babies, who were now stirring in her arms. His large, clawed hand, so capable of destruction, was unbelievably gentle as he reached out, his finger tracing the soft cheek of his son. He then looked at his daughter, whose quiet, watchful eyes were staring right up at him. A tear, bright as a diamond, traced a path through the grime on his cheek and fell onto the baby's blanket. "I felt you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every moment. The pain. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice ragged. I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you. You found us, she said, and that was all that mattered. He gently took one of the babies from her, cradling his son against his chest with an awkward, beautiful tenderness. He looked from the child to her, his golden eyes full of a love so profound it stole her breath. My queen, he said, the words a vow. The bond between them flared, no longer a source of pain, but a symphony of joy, relief, and love. On his hand, where it rested against his son, a new mark began to glow into existence. A silver swirl of light, a perfect match to the one on her neck. The bond was complete, shared. He led them from the darkness of the caves and up into the light. The battle was over. Malakor's forces had fallen or fled with the death of their master. Kale's warriors, his elite guard, stood waiting in the ruins of the fortress's great hall. They were bloodied and weary, but they stood tall. When they saw him emerge from the passage, they let out a triumphant roar. The roar died into a stunned, reverent silence as they saw her, and the children. Kale walked to the center of the hall, Alara at his side. He never let go of her, his arm a warm, solid band around her waist. He held his son. She held their daughter. He turned to face his people. Malakor is dead, he announced, his voice ringing with power. The Ember Covenant is broken. Another roar, this one louder, filled with savage relief. He held up a hand for silence. His gaze swept over his warriors, then came to rest on Alara. You have known me as your king, he said, his voice softening but still carrying to every corner. For centuries, I have led you. I have fought for you. But our people have been without a heart, without a queen. He turned Alara to face him, gently tilting her chin up so she had to meet his gaze. No longer. He looked back at his warriors. Behold, Alara, my mate, my soul, the Lightbringer who saved us all. He knelt then, the Alpha King, the most powerful being she had ever known, knelt in the dirt and rubble before her, before his men. He bowed his head. My queen, he said, his voice thick with devotion. Behind him, every single warrior to a man dropped to one knee. The silence in the ruined hall was absolute, filled only with the soft sounds of the two babies in their arms. Alara looked out at the sea of bowed heads. She looked at the mighty king kneeling at her feet. She looked at the daughter in her arms and the son in his. They called her Ash-tongue. They called her filth. They called her nothing. Kale looked up at her, his golden eyes shining with a love that healed every scar, filled every empty space inside her. He called her his queen. And for the first time in her life, standing in the ruins of her prison, with her family in her arms, she felt the truth of it. She was home.